Right. Good afternoon. This is Jim Kuiper from Argonne National Laboratory, and today I'll be talking about the Energy Zones mapping tool. Application was launched in 2012, and we've made some updates that I'll be talking about today, as well as a couple additions to the functionality. So a brief background about the project. On the right, you see the home page of this tool. It's available at ezmt.anl.gov. And it's publicly available. So the intention of this is to have a set of data and tools that all stakeholders can access with a convenient browser access. And this tool was originally developed for the Eastern Interconnection States Planning Council. That abbreviation is usually pronounced ICEPIC. And there was a collaboration of 3 national laboratories that were helping to develop the tool and some other background studies. And after some time, the funding was completed, and ICEPIC is now part of the National Council on Electricity Policy, which is a national organization. We also did quite a bit of work and are continuing to do a lot of work with Sandia National Laboratories, and a lot of that focuses on energy-water nexus activities. All of this work is funded by the Department of Energy, Office of Electricity, and since the original launch in 2012, there's been quite a bit of updates and enhancements, most notably extending the scope of the tool from the Eastern Interconnection to the whole U.S. for the mapping library and for the lower 48 states for the modeling capabilities. Another aspect of the scope is the energy resource categories. So there are 9 named here, and there's quite a few different technologies within each of those. For example, for wind, we have models for land-based as well as offshore wind turbines. Obviously, the siting factors would be somewhat different for those. And different types of solar, PV solar or concentrating solar, and other different combinations of technologies and energy resources go into the models that are in this tool. So the tool also has a large repository of data. There's over 230 mapping layers that you can access. All but I think less than 10 can be downloaded. So there are also a set of dynamic reports, and users indicate the area they want to run the report for, which can be a state or county or just an area that you designate within the tool. And it'll generate results for that location. A little bit more about the data library. There are some examples on the top right. It's got quite a diverse set of content. See, the focus is energy, so we have energy resource data, energy infrastructure data, and then a large repository of data that represents different siting factors that affect whether power plants or corridors would be appropriate for siting in a particular region. So, for example, bird conservancy data, you obviously would want to avoid a very high-value bird habitat area for an energy project. So that's rationale for those layers. For modeling, there are 2 types of models in the tool. First are power plant models, areas that are highly suitable for energy development. There's actually 43 of those. And then 3 different suitability surfaces for corridor paths. One that emphasizes following existing transmission lines, one that emphasizes following existing roads, and one that's more balanced, and just call it a general model. I'll get into that a little bit later. Analysis areas are used to designate places where you want to study or just view placed on the map, and corridors are linear versions of those. So we have tools to create those either by sketching them on the screen or generate them by modeling. And now you can also upload and download those features. The location of those new upload and download tools are depicted on the right there. These dialogues for analysis areas and corridors. They have columns for actions. So on the left there, that new icon allows you to download those features, and the drop-down menus on the right allow you to upload features. And then the dialog toward the bottom lists all the new updated models. So this iteration of the update concentrated on solar and wind models. as well as corridor models. This set is available for the full lower 48, and we think that's going to be of great interest because there's a lot of energy development out west, both with wind and solar, as well as a lot of interest and emphasis on new energy corridors and transmission line projects, as well as pipelines. We're always making updates to the data catalog too, so the last newsletter listed the current list of those, and you can also get those on the homepage under the news section. All right, so that's the last slide that I'm going to be presenting. The rest is going to be a live demo, and these are the main topics I'll be covering. So without any delay, I'll switch to the live demo. So I'm running this in Chrome. That's the browser that we use most frequently. A couple things to point out on the home page are that there's a register step to use the tool. And that's not intended to keep anybody out. It's intended to allow you to save your work within the tool. And it also gives us a little bit more idea of general things about the stakeholders using the tool. So it prompts you for an organization, what state or province you're in, and then your email is used as your account. And you provide your own password for that. So obviously I've already registered, so I'm going to click login. Oh, before I do that, I also want to point out the help menu here. We have a series of videos. They're only 2 or 3 minutes each, and they show how to use particular parts of the tool. And there's also a written printed help manual if you'd prefer to look up something that way. So I'm going to log in. And then any of these pages have this Launch Tool button, so you can enter that way. I was going to cover a variety of things, but some of it won't be linear with those 4 topics. It'll be kind of, throughout the demo, I'll be showing all these different tools working together. I think it makes a little bit more sense to use them in context instead of just systematically go through them. First, I'll show some of the more notable new updated layers or added layers. One that we've always been pretty proud of having in the tool is transmission line data of high quality. So that has been leased from Platts. You can see, like in this menu here, this is a download data icon. Platts is one of the exceptions. Since that's commercially licensed, we can't distribute that data, but we can. We're licensed to host it in the tool for folks to view. But recently, the Homeland Infrastructure Foundation has added a new layer for transmission lines that appears to be pretty good quality. So we added that, and they have a substation layer. You know, some of these other layers could be available commercially too, or are available commercially. It's just prohibitively expensive to include them all. It's pretty dense if you're zoomed out. But this is a quick way. You can just really have both layers on the screen and you can compare them. The symbols are a little different, so the changes in color are changes of actual symbolization on the map. But they aren't entirely the same. So in this example, see the Platts layer is having more connections to substations in this area, more complete. And these are a little bit more, smaller lines are black in the Platts. So these would be kind of small transmission lines. But I've seen other areas where the high-field data seems to have better coverage. And I think we'll see that later in the demo in one of the parts I'm going to concentrate on. So any of these features can be queried. You can click the Info tool and click on them. So here I found an electric substation, and I can take a look and see the criteria. So this one didn't have maximum voltage in the tool. I'll probably better pick a better example here. Oh, okay. So there are limitations, obviously, to the data, but this dialog will come up, and it also shows all the features that were at your click point. So if you close this section, you can see it also found some transmission lines underneath my cursor where I clicked, and you can see some of the details about that. It's a 69 kV transmission line I picked there. So there's a few new ones. In another area, natural gas. By the way, as I use the catalog, I'm using a lot of filtering here. So you can obviously just scroll through things, but each of these layers allows you to sort or filter on the contents. So I'm just going to put natural gas as my search, and the layers matching that phrase in the title are coming up. So here I'm going to show the pipelines, wells, underground storage, processing plants, and compressor stations. And why not the LNG as well? And so now we've kind of switched over nationally to a map of natural gas. In this case, the pipeline layer isn't the highest quality. There really isn't a good choice that I know of for higher quality pipeline data for natural gas. That's not commercial, but in most cases it corresponds to the larger lines. Let's see, another example of a recent update is the National Conservation Easement Database. And that's quite an ambitious layer. It's worth taking a look. This is a national layer, very high detail, a lot of records in this database. You can take a look at those, and you'll find usually private lands that have been granted some sort of easement with a protected status. So it's just an example of one of the constraints that you would have with power plant siting or corridor locating. Here's one, data came from the Colorado Division of Wildlife, and I think SHA is a state historic area. So any of these things also will have metadata. Point that out. I go back to that. This icon here will download a metadata file, and this will explain what the data content is. So if you don't understand what some of the fields are and what their values are, it should be explained in the metadata. So if you need to, you can go down to that level and learn not only that, but maybe how recently the data was published. There's also a way to expand this in here, and you can see the publication date is January 2017, and it was last updated in the tool about a year ago. Okay, so those are some data content in data mapping library, just viewing data. So now I want to switch a little bit to the upload and download tools. And so under analysis areas, I've got some loaded that I've already put into the system for my user. And I choose the upload button on the drop down there. So I'm going to, I already prepared an example. So just as an aside, it'll load shape files or GeoJSON files. In this case, I took 3 solar energy zones in Utah that we have from another project, and I grouped 3 of them into a little data set and saved them as a shape file. So that's pretty straightforward for a typical GIS user, and the only thing is shape files are actually a series of separate files, so the tool looks for a single file, and you need to zip them into one archive for that. So all you really need to do is identify some shape files, zip them up, and load them up. It's not really, this is not loading data, this is loading analysis areas. So the intent here is to designate a location on the map for further analysis. It's not just to load some GIS layer. So what it did was it used the name field in the layer, and it loaded this green polygon into the map. And so these are the 3 areas that I loaded out of that shape file. So each feature in the shapefile comes in as a separate analysis area, and now I can use that to run a report. If I, as an example, Milford Flats, this action runs a report. So that'll prompt you for what type of report. And for example, if I want to develop a solar energy project, I'm going to have to connect to electrical transmission. And I can view that on the map, but I also might want to just query what's in the area. So this report will do that. And I launch a report. Any of these things that are come up with a little launch will be in your results dialog. Here's the report. It finished running. They run in batch. So sometimes models take a few minutes to finish. And then I click that icon to view the report, which opens in a separate tab in most browsers. The analysis area is quite small. It's saying that there's really no significant transmission lines in that tiny area. But within 25 miles, there's a whole slew of transmission lines, including some that are over 315 kV, 54 miles of transmission lines. That's just a quick snapshot of some things. And there's all those other reports that you can run depending on the context of what you're trying to analyze. I'll be doing some more reports as we go on with the demo. So let's go back, and if we add transmission lines, I'll use both data sources and also substations. You can see that Milford Flats has some pretty nearby transmission lines as well as substations. And in this example, if I turn the Highfield on and off, that one seems to be more complete in reaching these substations than Flats. In this case, the Flats data isn't showing any lines reaching these substations, although we find them in the other layer. So between the two, they can provide a pretty complete set of options for seeing what transmission lines are nearby. We'll be looking at the models more generally, but I also would like to show you results of one of the solar models. You could have photovoltaic or concentrating solar, but if we look at the photovoltaic model in this region, you see that it's showing the scale, the oranges and reds are higher suitability, and it's showing that this region is understandably higher suitability for solar, and that it just kind of validates and clarifies that the solar energy zone is placed reasonably well for solar. And these other ones are a little bit lower suitability, and I think that's partially because they're not as close to existing transmission, which is a pretty big factor for siting a project. Now if we take a national view, you can zoom to max extent with this tool. So I'll just talk a little bit generally about some of these models, in particular the extended models. It's the lower 48 states. We don't have models for Alaska or Hawaii right now, or any of the U.S. territories. But we do have some data content, in particular for Puerto Rico, that we can talk about. And as I guess would be fairly expected, the Southeast has some of the best, not only solar resource, but the siting factors. As far as solar, the solar resource is higher there than for other latitudes, partially because of the drier climate. And you can see areas a little bit more to the east are a little bit lower for solar. And then other aspects of this model, other siting factors. Let me show you the model. So here I'm going to just filter on 48. So I quickly isolate the models that have been extended. And then if we look at the utility scale photovoltaic. So we have all these different siting factors in the tool. So the solar potential has the highest weight, and that's the first layer. But we also have all these other siting factors coming into play. So in combination, these factors, which you can adjust yourself and run with your own modifications, these contribute to that suitability score on the map. So some of these darker areas may be due to protected areas. Here's Yellowstone National Park, for example. Steep slopes, sensitive habitat, and large distance from transmission. All those different criteria come into play to generate a suitability score. And as I mentioned, you can adjust those for yourself. So bring this dialog. For example, if I didn't want to include environmental constraints, I could delete these out of the model. This is just your own local, model that you're running for yourself. And under land cover, I can inspect the assumptions that went into that particular layer. And each one of those land use categories has its own suitability factor. So, for example, if I think, well, I really don't want to sacrifice any more agricultural land for solar, let's zero that out. So you can make your own assumptions and make your own adjustments to these models and then try them for yourself. So that's the solar. Let's look at wind. All right. Do the land-based and the offshore wind turbines. Offshore and land-based are separate, and if I look at the turnoff, you can see with the offshore, obviously there are, coastal and Great Lakes are included there. One notable thing for offshore is the East Coast has a very wide and shallow continental plain, but the West Coast has a pretty steeply sloping bottom as you go. So there aren't very many shallow places offshore out west, and it's more likely that wind turbines out west offshore would have to be floating platform, different approach to that. Other things you can see in the results here again, you see a large protected area, Yellowstone National Park. Some of these urban areas are low suitability due to population density, not very suitable. And these models are down to 250 meters, so you can zoom in pretty close and see things and looking at what the constraints are for a different location. So these models in general are good for, say, prospecting, where you're saying, what area, look around, what might be a good place to site a project. And then the opposite would be designated an analysis area in the map. This is the area I'm interested in. Tell me about it. And that's kind of what the reports are for. We also have corridor models. So here's the three that I mentioned. Favoring roads, favoring transmission, and the general. Let's talk about the roads. Some of the major highways, you can even see them on the map here, generally the interstates. These would be major roads, and the strategy would be to site projects along major roads. At Argonne, we do a lot of work with corridors. It's interesting because in Montana, they actually, when they were commenting about their corridors, they pointed out that they have restrictions of placing anything near a road or crossing it. They're pretty strict about that. And it's a very scenic state. In Montana, it's actually a negative siting factor to site within kind of one of the interstate right-of-ways, you have some extra hurdles to deal with there. In other areas, it might be desirable, especially, for example, some of the passes going into California, a lot of transmission along the roads because that's one of the only reasonable places to cross the mountains. So the siting factors might vary in different locations, and you might need to adjust your model to fit the local assumptions. And the corridor modeling really does make more sense at a local level. What I'd like to do is, again, go back to another tool. Here, talk about corridors. And the one I was working with just today, this is a designated corridor in the western U.S. The way this works, by the way, there's a global toggle for analysis areas and corridors in the table of contents. And then within the dialog, you can turn individual corridors or analysis areas on and off with this icon. This kind of shows or hides it on the map. So this is it's a Section 368 energy corridor. So if I go to the data catalog, all right, let's turn this off. So this is an actual designated corridor. It's on federal land. U.S. Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, those two agencies designated these corridors based on a 2005 Energy Policy Act directive. And they've been very carefully analyzed and planned. There's a lot of thought that's gone into this corridor. However, this is a very controversial corridor because it was originally trying to follow a proposed project which was never built. There's a lot of problems with this route, and this corridor might not persist. But it's one that was an interesting case for modeling. So let's take a look, and if we take here's the suitability surface. What this is a surface that combines a whole set of siting factors related to corridors, and it weights those, just like the power plant model. And so these darker orange areas, we're favoring existing transmission lines. So if I resort this, it didn't work the way I wanted. It's hard to see there, but there's an existing transmission line in orange, right where the higher suitability is. So you can see that this suitability surface is favoring that as a little bit better criteria in the route. And then if we contrast that with, I've got too many models in here now. Here's the general one. It still has, there's subtle differences in this, but here the transmission lines are weighted a little bit lower. And then finally we have one that weights roads a little higher. So I think there's a road and a transmission line where I was indicating. So what we can do is use those suitability surfaces to generate a corridor between 2 points that we designate. So it's really a two-step process. The first is that suitability surface, and a good place to start are these default models that we've already set up. And then you go in the corridor tool, and you can say new corridor, generate from endpoints. So now I have this cursor set up, and I can designate the beginning and end of this corridor as an example. Double click to finish, and then give it a name. You can specify a width, that might be different than the default. And then you choose which suitability surface you want to route that. So if I choose general, I can choose a higher low resolution version of it. This is the longest running part of the tool, so we provided an option to run a faster low resolution version. I'm just going to do high resolution. And then that's launched. So it's running. We don't have a result yet. If you look in your results, you can see, I've got it filtered here. You know, the test I'm running is, that looks like it finished already. Okay. So turn the corridors back on the screen. In my corridor, now I have tests on the map. I'm going to turn off the one that I already had on there. And this is the route that was generated between those 2 points. So you can see that it's tending to follow this existing transmission line / road corridor. And I previously run a few, so I'm just going to put each of those on the map. The 3 models generated 3 different potential routes based on slightly different assumptions. And I'll tell you a little bit about, I know a little bit more about this corridor and why these routes are like this. Number one is there's, let's turn the federal lands layer on. Okay, so this is a tribal area, Warm Springs Reservation, and since the agencies were designated corridors on their jurisdictions, the actual 368 corridor goes outside of the reservation to provide an alternative for that. The existing transmission lines do go through the reservation. So if you were going to site on federal land, then that would allow you to do that. So that explains why the routes are going through this area. Federal land is not in this model as a siting criteria, but we do have a modeling layer, and you can use land jurisdiction as one of your siting factors. So you could tell it federal land out or leave tribal land out and generate different corridors that way. The second thing is that some of the 368 corridor routing is avoiding, I believe this was a proposed protected area, and that particular area is not in the siting layer that we're using. So there's some nuances in local data that will come into play. But the point of this corridor tool is not to find final right-of-way, it's to study routing alternatives. So really what you would do, the real intended use of this tool would be to examine what are the constraints and advantage, better and worse areas in my path. And you can see that in this location, the 3 models agreed with each other. So that could be either a pinch point or an area where it's especially clear or obvious that this would be a really good place for a corridor. And when they diverge, that's showing where subtle differences in your assumptions produce different results. And if you run a series of models, you start generating a region, kind of a region of interest for your corridor. And the intent there is just that preliminary analysis where you look at, really, you're already looking at quite a few siting factors, but you're thinking about what would be the constraints? Where are the pinch points? Where are the areas where I've got a lot of options? So if there's some landowner I find difficult to convince that, to have a right-of-way on their property, then I'd have an alternative route. All those different things can come into play. So I just invite you to try out the corridor modeling or the power plant modeling tools, especially in the West where there's lots of these issues coming into play. And these are the tools for doing that. Thank everybody for attending today. Have a good afternoon.